A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
Welcome, everybody. We're here with Jae Lin. Jae Lin is the hotline director of the Games and Online Harassment Hotline and a mental health advocate for video game spaces. They have a background in queer community health and suicide prevention with roots in collegiate esports. Jay is also a community organizer around trans liberation, queer arts, and racial justice in Austin, Texas. Jay, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here and have this conversation with y'all today.
All right. Well, we think it's a really important one, and we'd like to help you get the word out about the Games and Online Harassment Hotline. So, first of all, let's start with nuts and bolts. So, what is the Games and Online Harassment Hotline? Who does it serve? Why does the gaming community need a hotline like this? Or maybe more than one?
All right, the basic spiel. The Games and Online Harassment Hotline, it's a free, confidential, text message-based emotional support hotline for anyone who makes or plays games. We are currently in the U.S. only, so from anywhere in the U.S., you can text support to 23368 to get connected with us. You can text in at any time, any day of the week. We're online every day from 3 to 7 p.m. Pacific time. And so that's when we'll text you back. But you know, whenever it is, whether it's in the middle of the night or during your lunch break, you can text us and we'll get back to you within a day. And we talk to folks about a whole bunch of things. You know, I think our name is very specific. It's Games and Online Harassment. But, you know, we talk to folks about different mental health struggles they're having, stresses in their workplaces. There's a lot of crunch and burnout and mental health struggles, and also like abusive situations in workplace within the games industry. We talk to a lot of folks about that. And then we also talk to, you know, folks playing games who are experiencing harassment or dealing with other mental health issues or kind of community struggles. And then everything in between, you know, streamers, esports players, coaches, students. I know y'all are professors. We talk to a good number of students who, you know, fall into a bunch of these categories. They might play games and experience harassment there. They might, you know, experience some stress in their schoolwork, some anxiety about entering the industry, all of that. So it's not a lot of gatekeeping, not like very clearly defined things. We really just want to be a mental health, emotionally supportive resource for the games community.
I think that's great.
All right. I assumed, you know, when I first heard about it, I assumed, yeah, we're talking about online harassment of players, but it's so much more than that. What about that last part? Why does the gaming community need something like this?
I actually don't answer this question a lot because the first reaction I get from folks typically is like, oh, thank God, finally. I wish I had this when I was coming up or 10 years ago when I was really struggling with stuff like this. You know, I think for folks who have been in the gaming space, either on the industry side or on, you know, the player side, or anything in between, it's kind of a family secret that, you know, these like problems of harassment and toxicity are just so baked into our culture. And that has been actually pretty interesting. I'm taking a bit of a side tangent here. It's been interesting talking to, you know, there are other hotlines and other organizations who work on online harassment and digital security and different like online attacks and threats and stuff like that. And there is a different energy talking to them sometimes than I feel in the games industry and also just in the game space, because there is such a cultural element of it and like different flavor of it in the ways that it shows up in gaming.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I think in some other spaces, it might feel a little bit more us versus them. Like maybe we're journalists or maybe we are filmmakers or something like that. And we have there's this conception that there's like outside people, you know, attacking us online or coming after us. But in the games community, it's a little different because kind of from within the house, right? It's
Right.
gamers harassing each other. It's, it's within the industry. And I mean, not that it's totally binary and cut and dry like that in other industries either, but I do think that cultural understanding and element of how really it manifests in these unique ways in game spaces is part of what makes the Games Hotline really stand out. Because we've heard folks who have dealt with harassment for a long time or gone through like really awful abuses in game spaces, try to reach out for either mental health or emotional support in other spaces, either therapy or other hotlines or something else. And just getting met with this like reaction of like, not like, whoa, like that's so wild that happens like that, or like why would you play a game where you're treated that way, or that just doesn't make sense. And then the conversation is about their shock rather than what you're actually going through. And so to be able to talk to someone who gets it, of like, yeah, that is how it is. It sucks. Let's talk about it.
Right.
Makes a really big difference.
It's interesting to think that there's still a lot of people out there, because we feel like games are so ubiquitous now. Everybody's playing games, right? Everybody's experiencing games. Everybody's experiencing some kind of harassment. If they're playing online at all, if they're online at all, they're experiencing some sort of harassment. I can see where, like in a non-game specific space, they might just say, "Well, stop playing that game." Like there seems to be an easy solution to this. But that's not what we're about. We want people to keep playing games. We want the games community to be healthier. Right,
exactly. And I think a lot of folks outside of gaming might not understand like that there is so much beauty and healing and just like, I don't know, like games can be an incredibly powerful coping skill. It can be a really important and crucial like social element of someone's life. Developmentally, it can be really, really helpful and important to like teach young people agency and ways to explore their identity and, processing big and hard emotions like grief and all of that. There are so many wonderful and beautiful things about games. And there is kind of this dark side to the culture where, the toxicity and things can really like impact your mental health, make you feel actually more isolated or unwanted. And we're holding all of that. I do think some of this attitude has shifted over the last few years, especially kind of like you're saying, with like the pandemic for one, making a lot of people for the first time realize how much online is real life. I think a lot of people played like Animal Crossing when it first came out at the start of the pandemic. So more people are like accessing that like social connection and mental health benefit of games. And so, yeah, I do think some of those attitudes have shifted in a positive way, which is really exciting. But yeah, generally it can be hard to explain to someone who is not very online what it's like to deal with these kind of nuanced and complicated experiences.
You would think this would apply to any community, right? I mean, if you're providing any kind of therapy to a community, but you don't understand the community, right? It's really hard to do that.
It's not going to land.
Right? So, by the way, why just the I'm so used to thinking of the US and Canada as, one entity with virtually like a single, area code, even though, of course, it's not exactly a single, but this is for Americans only. Canadians don't get included?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's currently only accessible within the US, and that's a limitation of our kind of technology at the moment.
Okay.
Because we do SMS and short code stuff. That only works in the US.
Okay.
We are, as a teaser, working on some like WhatsApp integrations and stuff that would allow folks to, just like contact us through WhatsApp, just a non-SMS method. And potentially that may allow us to expand to Canada as well. I think it is very, like there is so much of the games community in Canada, both on the industry and player side. And it would definitely be lovely to expand. But as a pretty new hotline, we're only 2 years old. We actually just turned 2 this month.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah. we started where we are. And any expansion we do, we want to be really like conscious of like the cultural differences and make sure that we're doing it thoughtfully as well.
Great. Let me ask you. So this only happened 2 years ago. How did this come about? How did the hotline come about?
Yeah. So 2 years ago was like 2020. We launched in August. The year before that, 2019-ish, is when we really saw like the big kind of waves of Me Too hit the games industry, if you remember.
Right.
There was like the Riot stuff and the Ubisoft stuff. Like that's, we did kind of lag a few years behind some other industries to get there. But once it finally came to the industry, of course, it all just like flooded out, right? And we've been seeing, I feel like every summer since then, there's a new story, right? There's or an update or some sort of development. And I think that's a really hard thing to witness, but it's also a really wonderful release of what I think, I described a little bit earlier as a family secret, that these problems are not new. These types of abuses and, just like disproportionate impacts of violence and gatekeeping and entitlement in the games, especially industry space, they're not new. They've been happening for decades. And what's new is the headlines. What's new, what's surprising is that we're actually talking about it out loud.
Right.
And so that was just such a moment. And of course, even though these things aren't new, even though a lot of us, especially people who are, marginalized for either race or gender or sexuality, are very aware of like, all of this trauma and violence that happens, it can be, it's hard to watch it happen again. It brings stuff up. And also it like kind of dispels some like fog for folks who are sometimes experiencing it now. And so these waves, they cause kind of this like outpouring of, like people telling their stories from the past, people getting triggered who have experienced this in the past, people feeling like, oh my gosh, that's my workplace now. I don't know what to do about that. I love my job, but it's also like, I don't know if I can stay. It's also really hurting me. And it also affects people who are, wanting to come into the industry. Like, this has been my dream. I have always wanted to work for Activision Blizzard, and now I feel afraid. Should I be anticipating this? Should I quit and throw it all away? There's a lot that just comes up. And so in that moment, our one of our founders, Anita Sarkeesian, who runs Feminist Frequency, she just started talking to anyone that she could about this moment, what we need, what survivors need, what's missing, I guess, in our ecosystem of healing and of fighting back and of changing this culture. And one of the things, multiple things came out of those conversations, but one of them was just that there isn't a place for folks to go right now to talk to someone and just like have a soft landing pad. Even if we can't fix all their problems, even if we can't actually like, get out there and Superman it and save the day, just having a place to talk makes a really big difference. And she saw that because actually that summer when it really hit, Feminist Frequency opened up our DMs on Twitter, which if you know about the history of Feminist Frequency, that's no small deal.
Yeah.
Opened up those DMs and said, hey, if you're having feelings around this Me Too stuff, DM us, we're here. And no real hotline infrastructure set up, no real promise that anyone was trained, had no one, people didn't have any idea who was on the end of that account. And just dozens and dozens of folks came in and just wanted to tell their story. And we really felt in that moment the impact of like, it just makes a difference to feel heard, to feel like someone believes you. Even if there's, nothing substantially that we can do, that this is actually enough. And this is actually quite substantial in itself. And so from there, she pulled in Vu Gandin Lei, who has a lot of experience setting up suicide hotlines and other kind of crisis hotline work. I got pulled in for kind of my combined background in mental health and games and stuff like that, and worked for about a year to kind of set this thing up and launched in August of 2020. And now it's been 2 years.
Yay.
That's great.
All right. So, okay. You mentioned that the right now the hotline works in terms of MSS, right? So,
SMS.
SMS. Yes, sorry.
Right.
So, okay.
Text messaging.
Text messages. Yeah, let's just call it text message. All right. So, if I essentially contact the hotline, who do I talk to? And what sort of resources would they be able to connect me with? What sort of resource are they?
Right, yeah. So again, like I said at the beginning, right, what really makes us stand out is that we have both, all of our agents have both the like competency and training in, mental health and crisis intervention and, just holding that emotional support space, as well as an understanding and just like kind of baseline knowledge of the games community, the game space, and like just the prevalent issues of what comes up for folks in the community. And so, yeah, we have like a wonderful team of agents who take different text message conversations all throughout the week and month and year. And we really just hold that space. We have, we pull on a well of knowledge and just like lived experience. The founders are all, the founders and leaders of the hotline are all like directly impacted folks who have experienced abuse and harassment within game spaces and have just, it's just like been around the block. Like this stuff isn't new, right? Like, and so we have a kind of a wealth of knowledge there that we sit on and want to share. But first we just hold that door open and want to hear what's going on with you and what would be most supportive. And we can help answer questions. We can share like what we've seen be effective in similar situations that other people have experienced in the past. And we can, link out to different organizations or websites or information or resources or different places to contact for help, depending on, the situation and what folks are feeling. Because the reality is that like online harassment, it's easy to think of it as like this like technical or digital issue, but really more than anything, it's an interpersonal issue. And so sometimes those like technical fixes aren't just gonna work for it. It really requires that human connection because it's such a human experience.
Right. I'm really impressed that of the people that call in tend to be not just gamers or fans of games, but people who are also in the industry, people who are experiencing. I like that I'm impressed that it covers such a broad. Like the community is not just, and that's another thing about like we're in the house, right? It's the call is coming from in the house.
Yeah.
Like the fans feel connected to the people who make these games. And the people who make these games feel really connected to the fans in ways that I think are probably different in games because it's so iterative, and we have so many of this. As a game maker, I know my process is very iterative. I really want to get into my fans' heads when I'm making games for them. Our community, a game design community, and the game fan community is so much more sort of like we're all part of the same crowd. It's not like, oh, here's a bunch of people making stuff for somebody else.
Yeah. And I think that's, again, like has so much like beauty and power in that. Like you said, right? Like games are iterative in a way that some other media isn't, like films don't really come out with patches and updates and like new game balances and stuff like that.
Right. We don't, and movies don't spend, the last 6 months just watching people people watch their movies.
And so, there is this like interesting kind of intercommunal relationship that is different than in a lot of industries, and that opens up a lot of room for really wonderful relationships. We've also heard it open up a lot of room for a lot of conflict and harassment, and
Yeah.
often game developers then feel like they can't even step away from that harassment because it's their job.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of get to the kind of
Yeah.
types of harassment and that you deal with, and you mentioned some already, and I kind of want you to kind of if you can list some examples for us. But is the last one you're talking about, is that harassment from industry workers getting harassment from actual gamers, from actual players? Is that what you were talking about, or from the workplace?
Yeah, I think in that case that's what I was talking about. But it's all of it. It's all over. Yeah, for sure. Game devs definitely get harassed by their fans online. And it's not, and I want to expand it from game devs. I don't want to just say devs, like people who work in the industry,
Right.
from
Yeah.
publishers to marketing folks to voice actors we've seen a lot of,
Oh,
and
yeah.
all of that. So it really is expansive. So yeah, and it is interesting because there is that kind of more fan interaction of harassment. And then there's also within the industry, your colleagues may harass you as well, or there may be conflict or drama or kind of interpersonal issues there too. And then there's also workplace harassment and abuse and toxicity. And piled on top of, just working conditions that aren't always really human first.
Right.
Part of something again that is so wonderful about the games industry and the games community is that there's so much passion. So many people join games because they love games. This is all they want to do, and it's just been their dream for a long time. And sometimes there are workplaces who weaponize that to treat workers as disposable, to really cultivate this culture of well, if you love it, you have to give everything, give all of yourself
Right.
for it. And you know what? If you can't take it, if you can't deal with these conditions, there's a dozen people waiting for your job. So
Right.
Right.
suck it up
And
and
that's
get out.
and that's a really, really unhealthy attitude.
Yeah, it's really dehumanizing in a lot of ways, and really exploits that passion that could otherwise be used for such, I don't know, positive and generative.
Yeah,
means.
and people fall out of the industry this way who could be great, who could be the next stars. They could
Yeah.
make these amazing games, but that'll never happen because
Right. They burned out or were pushed out. And sorry to kind of build onto this too. On top of that, there's also, that gatekeeping and kind of gendered,
Yeah.
racial, kind of homophobic oppressions that are at play of who's a real gamer, who's a real developer who actually loves games, right? Or who's
Right.
who really has the entitlement to be here and who is constantly needing to prove themselves. There is unfortunately a really rampant culture of sexual assault and harassment in the games industry. It's really common to see folks being sidelined and dehumanized even further because of their race or sexual identity or disability, or even things like body size. We see stuff like that all the time as well. And I bring this up because, we talk about all these different examples and all these things that people go through, and then we talk about burnout and mental health. And it's so important to realize that these things are not individual separate problems.
Right.
They are all the same. They're all the same problem.
yeah.
It is all compounded and cannot really be separated out from each other. So we can't address burnout without addressing the sexism and racism and homophobia in the industry. It is all kind of tied up in each other because it's about how we treat one another.
It's interesting. That's super important, I think, to understand the connection between these things. Though it's interesting to me, right? I assume we'd be talking about, mostly the players themselves and how the players themselves face gatekeeping and how the
That's a
players,
whole other
right? And how the players themselves face, those kinds of, or almost all those kinds of harassments, right? And those kinds of threats, and let's save that just for a moment and stay on the industry itself, because it strikes me that some of this might be the case with lots of industries. So, especially creative industries. Like, I mean, there's a reason Me Too kind of started with the film industry, right?
Yeah.
And the music industry, not particularly better, right? Do they have similar kind of hotlines that deal with issues in their industry? Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, I know there are some really wonderful film organizations like Women in Film who have have done wonderful advocacy and I believe has their own hotline as well. There's the Me Too Times Up org that primarily works in like film and media. Film media and offers like legal support and other just like advocacy for folks dealing with that too. I think they've recently, or maybe not recently, expanded to include games as well, because there is such an overlap with like voice actors and stuff, and just creatives in general, music folks. There's a bunch of journalism, media rooms, or press rooms have like a really big problem with this type of thing as well. And they also have a lot of, there are some really wonderful like journalism orgs who do advocacy and support around this. We have a bunch of links and resources on our website, gameshotline.org, just so I don't imperfectly list all of them from my brain. But yeah, if you want to check out our website, we've linked to a lot of those things there. There are fortunately, a lot of really wonderful folks doing this work. We're a part of a coalition called the Coalition Against Online Violence. That is just like a bunch of folks working around harassment and digital safety, particularly for marginalized folks who tend to be more vulnerable to these types of attacks. And so that work is really inspiring, and it just, none of this can be done alone. And
right.
It really is a cultural and group effort.
And creating a network of people who are all working towards the same goal. It helps us all feel like we're not alone in this too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going back to the players themselves, right? When I think of harassment, I usually think of people getting trolled. And, I mean, there's obviously a lot of trolling in video games. And I can't help but wonder, I mean, here you have almost, not that this is a suggestion for anybody, but, if you want to troll, the perfect trolling target, like, an organization whose very goal is to help people. Do you guys get trolled? Does that ever happen? And when it happens, what do you do?
It's definitely happened since the beginning. It's again, we have our own kind of, the game space has its own flavor of harassment and stuff like that, but it's also not unique to us. Even as a hotline, suicide hotlines also get prank calls and stuff like that too. Oh, it's not uncommon, unfortunately. I think that the approach that we take to it is that I think it's interesting when folks decide to reach out to an emotional support hotline and, say whatever they're going to say. And whatever intentions behind that, we can't really know. But what we can do is hold the door open. I kind of see that as our job in those moments.
Yeah.
Whatever intention someone has, they might be testing the line to check out what it's actually about. You know how you like make fun of a thing before you're like, oh, I actually like, haha, therapy. That's who goes to a shrink, right. And then like in the back of your mind, you're like, oh,
maybe.
What if someone like took my like problem seriously, And so I wonder if some of that is that, of like, this is stupid, like a hotline for the, and just wants to check it out. And we hope that they find that we're here for them. And so we give everyone the benefit of the doubt. We hold out compassion, whatever they're bringing up, like we believe them, and we're like, yeah, that sucks. do you want to talk about it? You know, how has that made you feel? And really just like, yeah, holding out compassion and that benefit of the doubt, while upholding our own boundaries. You know, sometimes if it starts like really crossing a line, like folks being like really hostile towards our agents or just saying like repeatedly really inappropriate things, a lot of like white supremacist messages and stuff like that, we will eventually set a boundary of like, hey, if you continue talking to us like that, we're going to have to, you know, end this conversation. But we are here to talk about, you know, XYZ if that's what you're looking for. And so, yeah, I think all in all, we just try to out nice them, and and who knows, you know, maybe later they'll leave knowing that this is an open space for them.
Right. And I think it also helps that it's not broadcast, right?
Yeah.
When you're dealing with them, you're dealing with them one-on-one. They're not posting something to a public forum just to get a rise out of somebody. It's not going to work. Well, who else is going to see it? Nobody else is going to see it. Yeah. They're going to get if they get a rise out of some one person, that's not usual. Yeah, it doesn't have the same kind of audience.
Right.
And so you might get people who are come in trolling, like you say, who are in some ways just like, tell me I'm wrong, almost like in some ways a cry for help.
Trolling is really complicated. We had one of our favorite episodes we did actually on with someone who studies trolling, and boy, it turned out to be so much more complicated than we thought. You know, do people who think they may have been harassed or abused someone in gaming, like, you know, who are that kind of troll, that think, I feel bad about some stuff that I've done? Do they ever contact the hotline to kind of, you know, try to talk about what they did and maybe feel better about what they did as the harasser rather than the harassed?
Right. Yeah, that is really interesting. Like, this is actually something we didn't anticipate, but we got those folks texting into us and wanting to talk about things from the beginning,
Really?
right from open.
Wow.
Like our first week of open.
That's amazing.
We really didn't anticipate it. We were so focused on like, I've got to think about survivors, got to think about the like marginalized and vulnerable folks. But then these folks are, you know, some of the folks that showed up, and we decided not to shut the door on them and to offer them support too, because like I said, it's not an us versus them, right? It's all of us.
Right.
You know, even if we just think about the like lowest levels of harassment and toxicity, some of it just feels so baked into the games culture, right?
Right.
Like, it's a lot of times people are not flaming or saying really like offensive and, you know, like inflammatory things because they're evil or because they came up with it on their own. It's because they saw everyone else doing it. It's because someone did it to them. They had that behavior modeled. So they're just it just kind of mimics and repeats itself, you know?
Right,
like,
right.
I remember when I was doing like a lot of esports stuff more seriously, like maybe 10 or so years ago, saying rape as a positive thing, I don't know if y'all remember this, was like just really common. It was just really normal to just like say. I would hear it all the time in games.
How was it used as a positive thing?
Oh, it's like a win. It's like a victory. So like if we beat the other team or we had a really great team fight, we would say like, hell yeah, we raped them, and that would be celebratory, right? And that felt just so normal. Similarly, right, like homophobic slurs were just, you know, that's so gay, like very, like I remember saying all of those things when I was, you know, playing in those spaces, and I was young and I didn't know better, and I had just heard everyone around me saying that. For me, this was 10 years ago. This definitely still happens now.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm not saying that that's a thing of the past, but there is just this cultural element to it. And so if we really believe that like harassment as an issue is a cultural issue, it's the problem of the ecosystem, not the individual. We also have to extend that when it comes to talking one-on-one with people who have caused harassment or harm, even when it's escalated above the usual flaming, even if it's, you know, more abusive or more harmful. We just thought that, like, you know, it's not about picking out bad apples or something, because that's not the source of the problem. And what an interesting opportunity we have that kind of almost without us beckoning them, these folks felt like this was a place that they could be vulnerable and share about maybe some of the worst mistakes they've ever made. That's not an easy thing to do.
Right.
You know, I would struggle to talk about, you know, my biggest regrets and the worst things I've done.
Oh, yeah.
And I would also find it so valuable to have a space where I could talk about those things and be met with empathy and accountability of like, not someone to tell me that, yeah, what you did was okay and no big deal and don't feel bad about yourself, but to really meet me and say like, yeah, it sounds like you really regret what you've done and you want to do things differently in the future. Let's talk about that feeling. So that's where we landed of like, how can we provide that space? Because we think that change can't happen without it. And it just actually isn't, it actually, when we think about like resources that aren't in abundance in the game space, there aren't a lot of places where folks can really talk about, you know, causing harassment or causing abuse.
Right. Definitely. I mean, there's not a lot of places in society itself where, which is really interesting. It really makes me think about whether this is a common thing or not when it comes to hotlines, right? I mean, if you are someone that engages in bad behavior, you know, short of being Catholic and confessing it to your priest, right? There are very few places where you can really go anonymously and talk about that stuff. And, you know, in a culture that is not particularly forgiving, that's a very hard thing to do. And I think a really valuable thing that you guys are offering.
Yeah, I think for just our hotline, we see ourselves in this really kind of unique and, I don't know, almost lucky place in that, like, it's different than a report or like an investigation, right? Our job is not to find the facts of what happened. You know, if someone is coming to us with their story, maybe it doesn't all add up because sometimes our stories don't all add up when we tell them, especially for the first time. Maybe, you know, parts of their perception are off, you know, and maybe that's not how the person who is impacted by their harm would tell the story. But that's not our job to figure that out. We're not investigators. We're not, you know, we're no judge, jury, or executioner here. Like, we're just emotional support. So we're here to like talk about the feelings under that. And that, I think, is also kind of rare in our culture and society of like a place to confront the things that you've done that aren't punishment based and aren't like investigation kind of judicial based, right?
Right. How long do these conversations typically go?
I think we typically like 45 minutes to an hour, I would say.
I remember when I was in college, my girlfriend actually worked for the suicide hotline. And I would listen to her, and I was amazed by how she could do this. And I just gotta say, I'm so disgusted by the idea that anyone would call the suicide hotline as a fake call. It's just so incredibly despicable. And for the suicide hotline, it makes sense that it would be. I mean, back then there was also no texting. You know,
Right.
I don't know if things are different now, but it really makes sense. You want someone to talk to, right? I can also see lots of reasons why for something like this, you may want to go with, you know, texting instead. Why did you guys decide to go with text instead of voice for this kind of support?
We felt like folks in the game space would be more comfortable with texting.
Yeah.
A lot of folks who play or make games are very used to like communicating through text, either in games or online, like on Discord servers or whatever, or through like forums and other just like avenues of communication and collaboration and community. So we felt like that would be a familiar and easy and accessible way of communication. We also know that like it can feel maybe embarrassing or scary or, you know, for whatever reason, like wanting a little bit more anonymity, wanting a little bit more, I don't know, just like distance
Right.
to tell your story and talk about what happened and really trust that the person on the other side wasn't like, you know, waiting with a pen pad to figure out who you are, figure out whoever, you know, who you're talking about is. And so we felt that like texting would serve that purpose as well. Those were kind of some of the thoughts behind
I think
that.
I think there's a big difference between writing to somebody and talking to somebody.
Sure, right.
And I'm not a psychologist. Maybe Jay, you might know more about this than I do. But like the immediacy of speaking can be hard.
Yeah.
As opposed to like, well, let me think about this. I'm writing. I can think about it a little bit better.
Right. Yeah. And that you can like text in at any time.
Yeah.
And we'll just text you back, you know, that you can get it out in that moment, even if we're not online. There's definitely pros and cons to both, you know. Talking, there is a little bit more of a human connection. You can hear their voice. You can like read each other's emotions and tone a little easier.
Right.
There can be something soothing, just like hearing someone talk to you in a calm way. So there are a lot of pros to phone calls. There are also a lot of pros, like we were talking about, to texting, and that's where we landed for now.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I'm thinking about, you know, texting a therapist. Right. And that seems to be very different. But in a sense, this isn't.
But I know people who text their therapists.
That's a thing now.
Yeah.
It's a thing now.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I've never had that kind of relationship with a therapist where we would text. But I guess, you know, all kinds of relationships are available now for all kinds of communication styles and ways of sharing intimacy. Let me ask you about. I'm assuming that there's people who contact the hotline more than once. Is there a continuation of conversations? It's interesting because texting sort of allows that to happen, in a sense, or is it just kind of every time you get somebody new and all that?
We try to treat it as a new in each conversation as a new instance. Part of that is because we very intentionally don't want to keep case files on anyone. We don't offer long-term care. The kind of our role, we see it as like this like soft landing pad and hopefully ushering you off like kindly and to like your next destination. And so we don't keep case files. We don't like keep records on like each person who texts in that we can just pull up and be like, oh yeah, last time you talked about this. The literal like text system not only doesn't keep or display phone numbers at all. So like on the agent side, the agents never see anyone's phone number, only what you actually put into the system. It cuts off the last conversation. So you can't just like scroll up and see whatever they were talking about before. So it really truly treats it as a single instance. We think that gives people a little bit more agency if they want to like bring up like, hey, I've texted in before. We talked about this last time. It may be a different agent that they're talking to. They may not even be talking to the same person. They can talk about like, yeah, last time I talked with the agent about this. Like I wanted to give some like updates. I tried this. It didn't work. What should I do next? That's okay if they decide to do that. But sometimes people might decide to text in and use a different name, pretend to be a different person, and not want that connection, not want to be known in that way.
Right.
We want to leave that in the person's hands.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
It does. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the agents and the like how much training do people have and if any of our listeners wanted to become an agent, is that something you need?
Yeah. So we're constantly like learning and iterating. And so when I talk about training, it doesn't ever feel like you just do your 40 hours here and you're good to go. You know everything you need to know.
Sure.
And so, our agents currently go through a full like mental health crisis intervention training first that, involves many hours. I think in total, like with like role plays and observation shifts and all of that, about 100 hours on that side. Then they go through a game-specific training where we talk a little bit more about online security, a little bit more about game spaces. A lot of folks come in, they are either gamers themselves or they are developers or students studying to enter the games industry or something like that. But no one ever knows every bit of everything. So we go over kind of just all of it to kind of fill folks in on the different parts of the games community and what people typically bring to the hotline so that they have that kind of awareness and understanding. And also about like how to hold those accountable conversations, right? When we made that decision to continue supporting folks texting in about harm they've caused, we had to train our agents up on that because that is not an easy thing to do. It is not easy to hold those conversations because they're fraught, they're hard, and we want to make sure our agents are holding that line in an accountable way. And so, yeah, a bunch of like more specialty kind of skill building there that folks might not get on a suicide hotline, for example. And so with all of that training, they then get on the hotline and start like taking observation shifts with like a buddy, and then there's a supervisor on at all times to like support and help. And from there, it really is just like an ongoing learning process. You know, there are specific types of chats that are sometimes harder than others. And so we'll like have modules just for those types of chats, you know, deep dives into specific, you know, experiences or topics like addiction or blackmail and stuff like that. And it really is just an ongoing learning thing. And we're also still learning and building out, you know, what our infrastructure of things. Like as things come up, we're like, oh, we really need to learn how to like respond to that more effectively. So what experts can we reach out to? How do we build like a little bit of curriculum around this? How do we prepare our agents to be able to take some of these chats?
That's impressive, Jay.
It's a lot.
That's
really impressive.
Really a lot. Yeah. So to continue on Andy's questions, are you guys looking for more people to become involved?
Yeah, we don't have an open call for volunteers right now, but we definitely have had a lot of folks reach out with interest. So if the work we do sounds like resonant to you or someone you know, or just feels like something you'd be interested in doing, definitely contact us through our contact form on our website, gameshotline.org. We'll send you a follow-up with some like different volunteer info, and go from there.
Cool. Okay, now I gotta jump back on something that you said earlier. You mentioned blackmail. What kind of blackmail are we talking about? Is this with regards to employees or players or both? Blackmail is not the kind of thing I expected to hear about in a games harassment hotline.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, especially recently. We've had a lot of calls about blackmail. I use calls even though they're texts, but anyway, we've gotten they've come in for a long time. It's not like a super new phenomenon, but there has been a recent kind of surge in these just like conversations recently. Like all harassment, it looks a whole bunch of different ways. It is folks in the industry. It's folks who play games. It's a lot of catfishing. It's a lot of bullying from friends or exes. It's a whole bunch of things. Most often we've seen it's about intimate pictures that either you got catfished about or that like a friend stole from you or that you sent a friend in earnest and in a good moment, but now they're using it against you because they're mad at you or something. Threatening to send it to your family, your employers, your followers online. It's not a new form of harassment. You know, it used to be called like revenge porn. Was like a pretty common thing. I think the shift now is that it still definitely happens where people will post like videos or pictures of you without your consent online or on websites. But a lot of the stuff we're seeing now kind of circumvents a lot of the rules that have now come up. Like it's now like less allowed on websites to post, you know, intimate images without folks' consent. Now they're just like DMing it to your family or boss. And that sucks and is scary in a different way. So Yeah, I don't know. That's a lot of what we've been seeing lately, and it's interesting because it's it is something that isn't talked about very much because it's so quiet and full of shame, right? The whole point is that you should feel really embarrassed and ashamed and not want anyone to know. That's how, the blackmailer can control you and get you to do what they want. And so it is kind of this like quiet, but also really desperate suffering that that we're seeing a bunch of right now.
Yeah. Do you ever link callers up with legal help?
Yeah. Stuff like legal and law enforcement stuff around online harassment is really tricky because the laws vary everywhere. We definitely are not a legal helpline and don't have lawyers to offer advice. So if folks are really wanting to pursue kind of like a legal or law enforcement action, we, walk them through resources or just suggest that they find like a local lawyer to kind of help them out. But in reality, just the laws around that are really, it's really
They're
scattered.
everywhere, yeah.
It hasn't really caught up with the online stuff. Similarly, like some larger cities might have like a cyber crimes unit in their police department, but a lot of smaller places might not. And some of those officers might not even really understand what you're talking about. Like they don't know what Snapchat is.
Right.
And so we're really wary about like just telling folks to report and contact the police. Even if it is technically illegal, like that experience often isn't super helpful.
Right. And can lead to its own traumas too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you mentioned along with this, right, how sometimes you might usher people to their next destination, right? So one of these might be potential legal resources. What sort of other destinations do you sometimes offer to people if they say, you guys were really helpful, where else can I go for help?
That's a huge question. It really depends because we talk to so many people about so many different things. Sometimes if someone is really struggling with like harassment while they're playing a game, we might link them to some like supportive gaming communities that we've heard of. Some of them are like, centered around a specific identity. Like there's a Minecraft server for autistic folks so that, they're not getting bullied online as much. Or like there's like Queer Women of Esports. It has like a whole community of like esports players who are, queer of all gender identities, but particularly supportive of women. Yeah, there's just like, we might link them to a supportive gaming space. If there are like mental health concerns, we might link them to mental health resources. If sometimes people just want more information, especially about online harassment, of like what steps they can take, how they can feel safer. Sometimes they feel like harassment feels really violating, and like a lot of their stuff was just exposed. And so there are steps you can take to kind of lock down your security. We can send some like basic guidance and information about that. I don't know. We're also just like doing this work and talking about it all the time. So we're connected with like a lot of other orgs and stuff like that. So we have this like pile of information. It's not always relevant. It's not always what someone wants. But if folks have questions and want more information or want someone else to talk to or somewhere else to go and continue talking about these things, we can try to pull on that or try to think of a solution with them together.
That's great.
All right, final question. What do you want to leave our listeners with?
I think going back to the idea that it's no us versus them, all we have is each other. It's just us. It's about the way that we're treating each other. And of course, there are different scales of harm and harassment and toxicity. But there's a lot that we can practice, even in just our own relationships when it comes to navigating misunderstandings, creating like conflict that is generative rather than destructive, using that as an opportunity to build connection rather than push each other away. We really need to practice those skills in our community outside of moments of crisis so that we're ready to like embrace and push for this change when it needs to happen.
All right, Jae Lin, thank you so much for being on our show. Good podcast, guys. Really appreciate you. Thanks so much. Yay!
Thanks for having me. This was so much fun.
All right, play nice, everybody.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.